Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode number 214, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/214. And for this episode, I'm going to be talking about the press during wartime. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because there have been a few very concerning developments taking place in the last couple days. And I think that, as we like to do here on the Liberty Weekly podcast, it bears closer examination. So I thought we would take a bit of a deep dive on the history of the press during wartime. But as a roadmap, first we're going to be taking a look at those current developments that have taken place in the last couple days. Then we're going to be taking a step back and looking at the press during wartime throughout American history, going back to the First World War, maybe just a little further back. So then we're going to be taking that precedence and putting it forward, applying it to things that have happened in the last couple decades, and then kind of returning on what's going on currently. So things that have taken place in the last... Oh, before I get started, I wanted to tell everyone that the developments we're going to be talking about are pretty concerning. And so you guys will want to sign up, at least for my Substack. That way you can get on my email list, and that is the best way for me to stay in touch with you because I can download the CSV files and I have your email address permanently, so that becomes mine, of course, unless you cancel, in which case it's not mine anymore. But the best way to sign up for that right now is on Substack. I am migrating to a platform that is more mine, and I'm going to do that as soon as I launch a project that I've been working on behind the scenes. That might be one of the reasons why this episode is out late this week. So head on over to libertyweekly.net/Substack and sign up there. So that way we can stay in touch. If you want to, I do my bonus content through Substack as well, which is early access to my content. It's also early access when applicable, and it's also good for at least one bonus episode, full bonus episode of the podcast every other week. So to get right into it, we have a lot of content to get through, a lot of information to get through in this episode. The news coming out yesterday was that PayPal has canceled the account of Consortium News. And not only have they canceled Consortium News' account, they have also seized the balance of that account pending a 180-day investigation. And of course, this news comes out as the Biden administration has announced that they're putting forward what has been called the Ministry of Truth. And the director, her name is Nina Jankowicz, and she's kind of become like a villain of the internet in the past couple of days, rightly so. And she announced, on the 27th, so 5 days ago, that she has been appointed to serve on the Biden administration's Disinformation Governance Board that is part of the Department of Homeland Security, which is a very concerning development. And not only is it a concerning development because of the nature of what this portends, but also because she is one of the most unlikable people and cringeworthy people that I think I've ever come across. And of course, I've been in the internet world for quite some time now, knowing of people who are very undesirable and unlikable. So that's her portrait. Not just that, but her cringeworthy song and dance routines. And I'll spare you from it, but you'll see here just going through the tweet for those of you who are just listening to the audio version. She tweeted out on April 27th, "Cat's out of the bag. Here's what I've been up to the past 2 months and why I've been a bit quiet on here. I'm honored to be serving in the Biden administration Department of Homeland Security and helping shape our counter-disinformation efforts." So she puts up a newsletter from Politico, but here's the screenshot. A DHS from a Politico article. DHS is standing up a new disinformation governance board to coordinate countering misinformation related to Homeland Security, focused specifically on irregular migration and Russia. Nina Jankowicz will head the board as executive director. She previously was a disinformation fellow at the Wilson Center, advised the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry as part of the Fulbright Public Policy Fellowship, and oversaw Russia and Belarus programs at the National Democratic Institute. So you should be revulsed by that paragraph, as I am. And she says, here's my official portrait to grab your attention. Now that I've got it, a huge focus of our work, and indeed, one of the key reasons the board was established, is to maintain the department's commitment to protecting free speech, privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. Famous last words. More to come as we dig into the big job ahead. For now, thanks for the support. So to frame the issue, of course, this is coming forward, and later on in the episode, we're going to circle back to this. As I said, first we're going to take on the last few days' developments, then we're going to take a step back in history, then go forward in history, and then we're going to talk about Whitney Webb's piece at Unlimited Hangout where she tweeted this out today, who is a terrorist in Biden's America? So back to Consortium News here. For those of you unfamiliar, Consortium News was started by Robert Perry, a journalist who passed away, unfortunately, in 2018. Their headline, their banner is Independent Investigative Journalism and Political Review since 1995. And I believe that Will Porter and Kyle Anzalone had a piece published on Consortium News 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was one of the first pieces that they had published together, which was about that year's Afghan opium crop, their poppy crop in that year. And I'll try and find that link for you guys in a second, but it was a great article. So they are published, if you're familiar with Kyle and Will's work, they are published on Consortium News. But I went to their About page to kind of give you guys a better idea of just what Consortium News is all about. So they said they had a celebration of their 25th year anniversary on November 15th, 2020. The people that appeared for that celebration, just to give you an idea of who they rub elbows with, Oliver Stone, the famous Ukraine on Fire documentarian, among many other things, Peter Kuznick, John Pilger, Nat Perry, Diane Dustin, Ray McGovern, who's someone should be familiar with my audience as a frequent contributor at antiwar.com, Oliver Spencer, and Gareth Porter. Of course, Gareth Porter, someone that people should be familiar with from Scott Horton's work. Was hosted by Elizabeth Voss and Consortium News Editor-in-Chief Joe Loria. So figures in here who are friendly with Consortium News, whose work and writing appears on antiwar.com. From the late founder and editor Robert Perry, he says, when we founded Consortium News in 1995 as the first investigative news magazine based on the internet, there was already a crisis building in the U.S. news media. The mainstream media was falling into a pattern of groupthink on issue after issue, often ignoring important factual information because it didn't fit with what all the important people knew to be true. Indeed, that was the original reason that I turned to what was then a new media platform to create a home for well-reported stories and to challenge the many misguided conventional wisdoms. As one of the reporters who helped expose the Iran-Contra scandal for the Associated Press in the mid-'80s, I was distressed by the silliness and propaganda that had come to pervade American journalism. I feared, too, that the decline of the U.S. press foreshadowed disasters that would come when journalists failed to alert the public about impending dangers. Also, by 1995, documents were emerging that put the history of the 1980s in a new and more troubling light. Yet there were fewer and fewer media outlets interested in that history. The memories of Ronald Reagan and H.W. Bush were enveloped in warm and fuzzy myths that represented another kind of danger, false history, that could lead to mistaken political judgments in the future. Some of our early articles re-examined important chapters in the 80s, such as the October Surprise controversy from 1980 and evidence of Nicaraguan Contra cocaine trafficking. Though we have struggled with funding, surviving for more than 2 decades through a combination of our own frugality and the generosity of our readers, we have managed to produce groundbreaking journalism on many of the most significant issues of the day, including national security, foreign policy, politics, and the environment. We also looked at the underlying problems of modern democracy, particularly the insidious manipulation of citizens by government propaganda and the accomplice role played by mainstream media. Rather than encouraging diversity in analyses, especially on topics of war and peace, today's mainstream media takes a perverse pride in excluding responsible alternative views. It's as if the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and the others have learned nothing from the disaster of the Iraq War when they pushed the groupthink about WMD and betrayed their responsibilities to the American people and the people of the world. Despite all the death, destruction, and destabilization caused by the Iraq invasion, there was almost no accountability in the U.S. press corps, with many of the worst offenders still holding down prominent jobs and still engaging in the same terrible journalism. So there's a bit more, but we got a lot of information to get through. So if you want to go to consortiumnews.com/about, read the rest of that article. And we'll take a look at exactly what's going on here and take a look at other accounts that have been frozen from PayPal. As a larger point, what I think this portends is further escalation in the war in Ukraine. And what my main real concern is that this is foreshadowing an expansion of the conflict, this crackdown, and all the marshaling of the powers of censorship already taking out titans of the independent media like Consortium News. So the story reads, May 1st, 2022, PayPal cancels Consortium News account, may seize balance. The online payment system gave no warning or reason why Consortium News' account has been permanently limited. PayPal indicated that only if applicable will the balance be returned. So Joe Loria writes, PayPal has canceled Consortium News' account without any prior notice or due process and with virtually no explanation. As Consortium News is today launching its spring fund drive, so it happened the day that they were launching their spring fund drive, it has lost one of its most important ways for its viewers and readers to show their support through donations. Clicking on the yellow PayPal donate button on our homepage now yields this message: organization currently ineligible to receive donations. PayPal sent an email saying to Consortium News saying, you can't use PayPal anymore. We noticed activity on your account that's inconsistent with our user agreement, and we no longer offer you PayPal services. Because of potential risk exposure, we've permanently limited your account. You'll no longer be able to use the account for any transactions. The message says that, quote, any money in your PayPal balance will be held for up to 180 days, after which, if applicable, we'll email you with information on how to withdraw any remaining money. So that's reflected in Consortium News' PayPal account. So there was no notice again, no prior notice sent, nor was Consortium News afforded any due process. PayPal customer service agent confirmed in a telephone call on Sunday that the, quote, back office gave no specific reason for permanently limiting Consortium News' account other than an investigation and review of Consortium News' history found some potential risk associated with this account. She said the potential risk from Consortium News is, quote, not exactly specified at the back office. It has something to do with the history of this account. Asked whether any agency, government or private, or any individual had complained to PayPal about Consortium News, the customer service agent replied, I don't see any existing case. Further, the agent couldn't explain why Consortium News was given no notice or any due process, but promised to ask the back office to contact Consortium News to explain. Regarding the $9,348 balance in Consortium News PayPal account, the agent said that after a 180-day review, PayPal would decide whether to return it. If there was a violation, she said, it is possible the money could be kept as damages to PayPal. Violations under the restricted activities of the user agreement included providing, quote, false, inaccurate, or misleading information to PayPal, other PayPal customers, or third parties. Loria continues, given the current political climate, it is more than conceivable that PayPal is reacting to Consortium News coverage of the war in Ukraine, which is not in line with the dominant narrative that is being increasingly enforced. Last week, PayPal also froze the account of the alternative news site MintPress News. PayPal was sued in California in January in a class action for similarly shutting down accounts. So let's open that a little bit. We're going to get into the Consortium or the MintPress News shutdown. However, Consortium News linked to that class action lawsuit, and it's on Bloomberg, but I'll get past the paywall. It says, PayPal sued for freezing customer accounts without explanation. The digital payment platform accused of racketeering and lawsuit. Hold on money drew ire of the former World Series of Poker championship. Interesting. So from MintPress News, from Mnar Adley, and I apologize if I mispronounced the name. PayPal banning myself and MintPress News is blatant censorship of dissenting journalists and outlets. For the past decade, MintPress has been unapologetically working as a watchdog journalism outlet to expose the profiteers of the permanent war state. So here's the statement. This is on April 29th. So we have on April 29th a statement from MintPress News, and then on May 1st from Consortium News. So I wanted to go so you guys know a little bit more about MintPress News itself. MintPress News is actually an outlet that I have cited in my work on Haiti specifically. But let's see, you can see kind of a taste of their coverage. I know that MintPress News is a little more left-leaning, and they would identify as being, I believe, anti-imperialist, which is, if you get familiar, a little bit more familiar with the anti-war scene, you'll find that folks on the left more identify as anti-imperialist instead of anti-war. And I've always found that people on the libertarian side will say, you know, I'm anti-war. That's just an observation that I've had. And of course, you guys know I've kind of been covering foreign policy in this world maybe a year at this point in time. So I'm not an expert in this area, but these are just observations that I've made. So about MintPress News on their About page, MintPress News is an independent watchdog journalism organization that provides issue-based original reporting, in-depth investigations, and thoughtful analysis of the most pressing topics facing our nation. We focus our coverage on issues relating to the effects of special interest groups, big business, and lobbying efforts, and how they shape policies at home and abroad, including American foreign policy. Through the lens of social justice and human rights, we report on how these dynamics drive our foreign affairs and impact the world, and examine the effects that they have on our democracy and freedoms as defined by the Constitution. Journalism, as defined by the First Amendment, plays the role of watchdog over the government. This is what inspires our style of reporting at MintPress News. We are a for-profit organization. Our goal is to be funded through advertising, syndication, and other traditional funding sources. Because we strongly believe in citizen-driven journalism, we accept online donations. However, we are committed to rejecting any funding sources that attempt to influence what we report on and how we do so. MintPress is tenaciously committed to total editorial freedom and journalistic integrity. So if you head on over, you can see some of their investigations. They have podcasts, videos, and articles as well. And this article was linked by Joanne Leon from our group that we have a group chat with me and Kyle and Joanne and Connor Freeman. And she shared this article as being an example of MintPress News coverage of the war in Ukraine. They put out a piece on, April 25th, 2022, entitled Old Propaganda, New Cold War. An intellectual no-fly zone. Online censorship of Ukraine dissent is becoming the new norm. So they go through here and they link Abby Martin. Anyways, they start, Google has sent a warning shot across the world, ominously informing media outlets, bloggers, and content creators that it will no longer tolerate certain opinions when it comes to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In fact, I believe that Scott Horton got an email from Google about this too. Earlier this month, Google AdSense sent a message to a myriad of publishers, including MintPress News, informing us that, quote, due to the war in Ukraine, we will pause monetization of content that exploits, dismisses, or condones the war. This content, it went on to say, includes but is not limited to claims that imply victims are responsible for their own tragedy or similar instances of victim blaming, such as claims that Ukraine is committing genocide or deliberately attacking its own citizens. Wow. This builds on a similar message Google's subsidiary YouTube released last month, stating, quote, our community guidelines prohibit content denying, minimizing, or trivializing well-documented violent events. We are now removing content about Russia's invasion of Ukraine that violates this policy. YouTube went on to say that it had already permanently banned more than 1,000 channels and 15,000 videos on these grounds. So Abby Martin had to say, quote, it is really disturbing that this is the trend that we are on. adding, quote, it is a preposterous declaration considering that the victim is whoever we are told by our foreign policy establishment. It really is outrageous to be told by these tech giants that taking the wrong side of a conflict that is quite complicated will now hurt your views, derank you on social media, or limit your ability to fund your work. So you have to toe the line in order to survive as a journalist in alternative media today. So we had Abby Martin's brother, Robbie Martin, on the show a few episodes ago to talk about his documentary, A Very Heavy Agenda. And in that documentary, he kind of talked about how Abby Martin, she was a anchor on RT, and she came out and gave a statement of her feelings about I believe it was the 2014 Maidan coup. And so, if you remember that episode, you'll remember. But MintPress News, they have good coverage from what I've seen, and I think it's truly terrible that their PayPal account has been frozen. And I definitely would consider them to be fellow travelers, although, of course, you read from the About page that we don't necessarily come from the same angle, but I think they're incredibly valuable as a source for independent reporting. Same thing with Consortium News, and they're not let's focus just a little bit here. Lee Camp, I believe, is producing or is associated with MintPress News, and at any rate, MintPress has linked this it's not a GoFundMe page, it's an Indiegogo page started by Mnar Adley. Let's go behind the headlines. So I'll try and put a link to all these things in the show notes page so you can head on over and help support these independent media platforms, because, we really are fighting a war right now. And I hate to use that rhetoric, but it's on. And I guess that's why I'm doing this whole episode anyways. So, all right. So the next person kind of in our circles who has been banned from PayPal is Geopolitics and Empire, which is a podcast that I enjoy listening to myself. We have this article from Jose Nino at the Liberty Conservative. Popular anti-war channel Geopolitics and Empire gets banned from PayPal. So the founder and host of Geopolitics and Empire announced on April 29th that he was banned from using PayPal. PayPal sent him the following message: you can no longer do business with PayPal. We recently noticed an issue with your account. Because of this issue, your account has been permanently limited. Kind of sounds like the same as what Consortium News got. So on LinkedIn, Morik, the Hirovi Morik, I really hope, especially because I'm a listener, I really hope that I'm pronouncing his name right. But Geopolitics and Empire, he posted on LinkedIn, this week a number of podcasters, writers, and journalists were banned from PayPal, including the host of Geopolitics and Empire, likely at the direction of the U.S. government. This can loosely be defined as fascist corporatism, which is, quote, used to suppress political dissent. Liberty Conservative Network reached out to Morik for his thoughts on the matter. He said, back in December 2001, I commissioned the costly creation of a new website for Geopolitics and Empire, which would include a membership integration allowing me to better finance my fledgling podcast work. At the time, the web developer chose a membership system which included only two payment processors, PayPal and Stripe. I asked if there were further options available because I told him I was expecting to be deplatformed from PayPal and or Stripe. I believe my request went over their head because they don't deal with nor understand the nature of the work that people like I do. I assume they thought it was a strange contingency to be preparing for as they deal with mainstream business. He added, here we are a mere 4 months later, and I've been banned from PayPal just as I expected, along with MintPress and Consortium News. The fact that all of us were taken down in the span of a week, the same week the DHS created a Ministry of Truth, which we're going to revisit, leads me to believe that the, quote, private company PayPal decided to deplatform, which leads me to believe that the, quote, private company, unquote, PayPal decided to deplatform us at the behest of the U.S. government. I consider this fascist corporatism. America is now openly becoming a totalitarian state, and this is something I've seen coming for close to 2 decades, which was one reason I expatriated and why I've been saying that we once again find ourselves in the 1930s. And then the broader context of a hot war against Russia in Ukraine is given in the article by Jose Nino, U.S. waging the proxy war, which is we're going to talk about later. It bears repeating that big tech and big finance functions as Pinkertons of the deep state. Kind of, I talked about the hand in glove on the last episode I was on with Keith Knight and Tommy Salmons on the Libertarian Institute weekly webcast, which I'll put in the show notes page too. I should really do a better job of plugging my appearances on other podcasts, but I'll put that in the link. And we discussed for a few minutes the situation with Elon Musk possibly buying Twitter. Seems like it's going to happen, but the skepticism about, is free speech returning to Twitter? Is that really what's happening right now? But also this problem that libertarians have had for the past few years where, the whole, it's a private company, bro, type thing where, it doesn't seem like libertarians have this great answer, that libertarianism doesn't really have a great answer for the problem of internet censorship. Some people would say, Lolberts maybe would say, well, these are private companies, they can do what they want, and so therefore we don't have any grounds to complain about exactly what's happening. But again, when these private companies have a government-granted monopoly, that they do the bidding of the governments, that they receive funding from governments, or tax breaks, or regulatory breaks in terms of regulating out the rest of the competition, can we fairly at that point in time say that these are purely private actors, or are they just cogs in a fascist corporatocracy, a fascist regime? So I wanted to show you the Geopolitics and Empire website that was discussed. Like I said, I do listen to interviews on this podcast, and he has a lot of really good interviews. And I've been meaning to try and connect with Geopolitics and Empire. All right, so that is the current kind of developments in the last few days. And like I said, we were going to take a look at those current developments, all these creators, Consortium News, some of their connected content creators, and MintPress News, and some of their associated content creators being banned from PayPal, and Geopolitics and Empire being banned from PayPal as well. Also, there's the Stripe connection too, which I think affects me because like I was saying at the beginning, the Substack accounts like Glenn Greenwald and Aaron Matei, some of these other people on Substack runs all of their subscriptions through Stripe, which is interesting. And I'm wondering if and when that shoe is going to fall, because the website I'm building is still running on Stripe. It'll be exactly like Substack, like I said, but it will also be on Stripe. So kind of interested to see how that is going to play out, because there are a lot of writers on Substack, and Substack hasn't caved to censorship that I know of yet. And so wondering when that shoe is going to drop, if it's going to drop, or if Stripe is going to be a little more tolerant of dissident voices because of that client of Substack. And I think it's an interesting development. But at this time, there really isn't another kind of cost-effective alternative. There are payment processors through like WordPress and things like that, but there's an incredibly high subscription fee that you have to pay with it. And it seems like it all just runs through either Stripe or PayPal anyways. So if any of you out there know of some kind of alternative, I mean, like full disclosure, I am pretty wed to this idea of switching to libertyweekly.club, where I'm going to have the same Substack features, just with my own website on the Ghost platform that I actually own the infrastructure, the website for, instead of a centrally located platform like Substack. So, hey everybody, welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The Libertarian Institute fundraiser has successfully concluded with your help, so thank you to everyone who helped support the Institute. We really appreciate it. We were able to raise $62,000, well, $62.5 of our $60,000 goal. So we really appreciate that, and you help keep us going for a bit longer here. The other way that you can help support my content directly and get special access to what I do is libertyweekly.net/Substack. I've been running all my benefits through Substack lately, where you can get preprints of my articles before they publish. You get bonus episodes of the podcast. You also get early access to forthcoming episodes as they apply. So I told everyone that I'm looking to migrate my Substack to a platform that I actually own that has a lot more features than Substack does. Well, I'm working on a new book, and I'm not going to do that migration until the book comes out. So I'm working with Connor Freeman. We're going to put out a book about China. We're really excited about it, working hard on it, hoping to do that and get it out within the next couple months here. But I'm not going to do that migration until that happens. So if you want to get better access to what I'm doing and get updates on things like that project, and some bonus episodes, behind the scenes stuff, head on over to libertyweekly.net/Substack. And if you go to libertyweekly.net/support or hit the side scroller button here at the head of the website, you can find a whole bunch of other ways to support me. Patreon supporters will be getting the same bonuses. But if you want to give a one-time gift, head on over to libertyweekly.net/support to do that. Also, you can help out the show. I've been getting a lot of traction lately, so keep it up. Share, subscribe, like, rate, review, do all those things. You should know by now how to boost your favorite podcast. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you listening, and we'll catch you next time. Oh, yeah, and also, guys, I'm so terrible at, telling everyone about guest appearances that I've made on other shows. I was recently on an episode with Kyle Matovic on In Liberty and Health, where I joined Angela McArdle, the future chair of the National Libertarian Party, to talk about the populist right and kind of the post-libertarian moment and share some thoughts on that. I know this episode specifically has to do with that, but I elaborated a lot more on what my thoughts are in relation to that and why I think it's important to offer a bit of a critique, even though I don't condemn those people. I wish them luck when it comes to what their strategies are, but I have to speak the truth as I see it and what I believe and be honest about it, and the concerns that I have with these kind of subjects. So go check that out. I'll put a link in the show notes page below at libertyweekly.net/213, and you can find the link to my appearance with Angela McArdle and Kyle Matovic. Well, I said, excuse me, lots of talking. I said we were going to go back in time. So we are going to go back in time. And I found this Routledge article by Daniel Smith, Avoiding Bloodshed, U.S. Journalists and Censorship in Wartime, War and Society. Actually, in wartime. Jesus, sorry about that. So Avoiding Bloodshed, U.S. Journalists and Censorship in Wartime. And I'm just trying to find reason I stumbled over my words here. School of Humanities and Social Sciences, the University of New South Wales. So I believe that's in Australia. I just had an Aussie on the podcast. So although this was published at the University of New South Wales, Daniel Smith is from the University of Maryland in the United States. So I thought this was a really interesting article because it examines censorship of U.S. journalists in World Wars I and II, in the Korean War, Vietnam War, and the Persian Gulf War. And we're not going to go through the entire length of this academic article here. This won't be like when I did that episode about Project 2049. And the reason I did that is because I read a few articles verbatim for the most part. But the reason I did that is because that was the exact information I wanted, and I didn't have time to reinvent the wheel. So I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. But on this one, we kind of go through World War I, right? So what are some of the things that took place in World War I? Because in many ways, it seemed like World War I, the Civil War, rather, we heard, talk about Abraham Lincoln jailing critical journalists and silencing opposition. So there's a lot to be said for that. But World War I was another instance where the press was extremely regulated and limited during wartime. And in fact, you have this author, Daniel Smith, starting off the article by quoting General William Sherman, the famous U.S. Civil War Union general who basically burned down the entire city of Atlanta. And so I think that in a way discredits what he's saying. But the quotation is, "The Union journalists publish information of movements, past and prospective, organizations, names of commanders, and accurate information which reaches the enemy. The journalists are the direct cause of more bloodshed than 50 times their number of armed rebels." So this is General William Sherman. I don't know if he has an official term in the mythology, but basically the butcher of Atlanta, the arsonist of Atlanta, who's going through and talking about, he's preaching to you as a journalist or as a citizen about how, it's dangerous to be a citizen journalist or to publish information about what we're doing in the war, because you see it actually costs more lives. Never mind the fact that my hands are soaked with blood personally. And not only did General Sherman burn down the city of Atlanta, but there was also Sherman's March to the Sea, which was kind of a scorched earth policy of brother against brother in the United States. So this article kind of talks about how it wasn't until the Mexican War that U.S. officials censored journalists over reporting war information, which I know that there was a time when Abraham Lincoln was censoring U.S. journalists too, but that's the way that this article kind of frames the whole issue. That under martial law in Mexico, U.S. military officers closed newspapers that officers claimed could undermine U.S. operations, including the American-owned Genius of Liberty, which criticized military efforts in Veracruz, Mexico. In the Civil War's short-lived gentleman's agreement between Union General George McClellan and numerous journalists agreed to avoid reporting, quote, any matter that may aid and comfort the enemy, while the government afforded journalists facilities for obtaining and transmitting information suitable for publication. So very early on, it seems like you have this relationship being established in the Civil War between journalists, at least in the Union, carrying water for the Union Army and for the Union government, reporting only what they want to be reported on. And another large theme in this article is talking about really analyzing what the real tangible damage is, because you have that quotation at the beginning, General Sherman saying how Union journalists are actually responsible for much, much more bloodshed. Well, this is a narrative that we see going on throughout the entire last 200 years, ever since the Civil War in the 1860s. You see this narrative come forward, probably even before that, we have to limit the press, because if we don't limit the press, you'll actually have more people will end up dying, and the press will be putting our soldiers in danger and everything like that. And you even see that, their ears should be perking up here, because that's exactly the narrative that came out against Julian Assange when he published some of his leaks, and Chelsea, then Bradley, but now Chelsea Manning as well. So we have that narrative kind of going forward during the past, since at least the Civil War. So during the Spanish-American War, U.S. military personnel routinely censored journalists' telegraphs for mentions of, quote, projected movements of bodies of troops, naval vessels, and transports. However, it wasn't until World War I when the U.S. government or military forced journalists to avoid public disclosures of long lists of types of war information by chronologically examining censorship of U.S. journalists in all these different wars. World War I, II, Korea, Vietnam, Persian Gulf. This article answers the following questions. From war to war, how did censorship work? What types of info did the government or military censor? Have trends emerged regarding types of censored information? And to borrow General Sherman's word in this article's opening quote, has any censorship avoided bloodshed or otherwise been legitimate? This article concludes by examining how in any future U.S. wars, the government, or military should most legitimately ensure safe reporting. So during World War I, before the Supreme Court decided any significant cases dealing with the freedoms of the press or speech, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 suppressed journalists. And again, this will be becoming relevant later in the episode as we kind of talk about, just touch on those acts briefly. But the Espionage and Sedition Acts banned publication of numerous types of information, such as the, quote, movement of armed forces and words of disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive, and words disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive to the government or flag. Under these acts, courts convicted several journalists, including a Missouri Staatszeitung editor, who stated U.S. war involvement was, quote, outright murder without serving anything practical, and 3 Philadelphia Tageblatt reporters who published such articles as, quote, Yankee Bluff, which said America was incapable of fighting Germany. Though later overturned, a court convicted communist leader Rose Stokes for writing in the Kansas City Star, quote, I am for the people and the government is for the profiteers. The Navy censored thousands of journalist dispatches and communications sent through the war zone, while the post office suppressed publications in the U.S. mail. The Navy targeted journalist dispatches that officials believed could cause dissatisfaction with the war, such as a message describing a potential labor strike at a Connecticut munitions factory, and another message about a U.S. soldier convicted of raping and murdering a French woman. The Navy also suppressed dispatches exaggerating America's war preparations or capability, which officials believe could inflate confidence in America's real strength. An example was this telegram from Washington correspondent to a London newspaper about new American tanks. Quote, America can turn out thousands of these high-speed murderous tanks day. Sick. The post office blocked about 75 newspapers from the mail, including the public, for saying America should avoid loans and increase taxes to pay for the war, and the Milwaukee Leader for saying America was fighting for, quote, washed-up allies. Again, context there, Milwaukee was a huge German spot during World War I. There were so many Germans there, and German brewing as the main industry in Milwaukee. The masses saw the post office block its issues containing such material as a cartoon titled Conscription, which showed dead bodies labeled Youth, Labor, and Democracy, tied to a cannon, and a poem calling war critics, quote, elemental forces. So again, none of these instances here really, none of them can point to any kind of tangible casualties that were directly caused by any of the content that I just cited here. And in fact, you can make some kind of loose parallel or analogy from this post office blocking newspapers from being delivered through the mail, newspapers who were critical of the war effort. Civil libertarians call World War I among the most oppressive times for journalists in U.S. history. According to constitutional standards the Supreme Court set after World War I, all this censorship violated the First Amendment. However, at this time in U.S. history, neither the public nor the press itself valued the press's role of being a watchdog over the government and military as much as they do today. I think that's a pie-in-the-sky statement right there. So the military controlled correspondence by restricting their access to cover war operations. The military never allowed more than about 40 correspondents into the war zone, even making ones with access pay $10,000 bond to ensure that they would act as, quote, a gentleman of the press. For much of the war, correspondents couldn't take pictures of the front lines, and when the military finally permitted picture-taking, correspondents had to submit all photos for censorship review and could never show U.S. dead soldiers. Correspondents endured military censorship of their dispatches and communications through a review system and had to agree to censorship rules. They faced the constant threat of having their either being dismissed, detained, or suspended for violating these rules. So, akin to the DHS, Department of Misinformation, in 1917, the Committee on Public Information was established to influence public opinion of the war, mostly through massive propaganda efforts. They issued U.S. journalists long lists of, quote, voluntary censorship rules in the preliminary statement to the press of the United States and in what the government asks of the press. According to historian James Mock, about 99% of journalists followed the rules throughout the war. James Keeley, editor of the Chicago Herald, said his paper was, quote, willing to cooperate to the limit with the government. Lewis Wiley, business manager of the New York Times, declared U.S. newspapers, quote, wholeheartedly accepted the censorship rules. Certainly all the background censorship by the government and military, such as suppression of journalist dispatches and publications in the U.S. mail, encouraged such widespread compliance by journalists with the Committee on Public Information censorship rules. However, some journalists opposed the rules, such as William Hearst. He owned many newspapers during World War I and said he'd rather close his papers than endure this censorship. Hugh Hughes, editor of the Farm, Stock, and Home magazine, complained that most of the rules were pointless because most of America's enemies discover U.S. military secrets without help from the press. Other journalists, the Lexington Herald, claimed the rules deprive the public of information. So then it talks a bit about how the how the CPI separated news into different categories: dangerous matters, questionable matters, and routine news. Of course, they didn't want anyone publishing any dangerous matters, which included details of military operations in progress, assassination threats, or plots against the president or other high officials. Let's see. Secret orders or other secret instructions regarding lights, buoys, and other guides to navigators. Details of communications between war vessels. Duties assigned to special combat units. The location or number of troops, warships, mines, and anti-aircraft fixed land defenses in the U.S. Experiments or inventions in war materials. Dry dock, so you couldn't report on the Manhattan Project, for instance. I mean, I know that's World War II, but that's an example. Like radiological weapons, things that I've covered, chemical weapon developments. So if you're a U.S. journalist and you're worried that, say that you've uncovered that the United States is planning, like creating toxic nerve agents or creating, certain types of cold viruses that have been, gain of function or something like that. If you want to report on that because you're concerned about, collateral damage, or you're concerned about people being massacred, that, of course, that's dangerous information. So regarding questionable matters, the CPI said that there were too many to list. However, some examples were narrative descriptions of past military operations, descriptions of life in military training camps, and they said that those descriptions on questionable matters would easily include dangerous matters. So in a more general request, the CPI asked journalists to avoid reporting as legitimate news the many rumors dealing with the war going around the country that the CPI believed German enemies propagated. So as I covered on this podcast before, and I believe I covered it with Keith Knight, we talked about falsehood in wartime. And I should put a link, if I remember, a link in the show notes page to that. But if you just go to libertyweekly.night and type in falsehood in wartime, you should be able to find it. That's not the title of the episode, I just remembered. But if you go through, there were so many lies that were told during World War I about what the enemy was up to. Germans, cutting the breasts off of Belgian nurses, Germans putting babies on bayonets, Germans collecting their dead and rolling them up in bales of barbed wire and carting them off to munitions factories to be melted down and made into glycerin for ammunition and bombs. And so, yeah, those are just a few. But the CPI explicitly says, well, it doesn't say that, but it says you just can't report on rumors that we think the Germans are propagating during World War I. And indeed, many newspapers even published columns the CPI wrote refuting the rumors, which the papers commonly called German lies. The Toledo Times, for instance, published CPI accounts that refuted rumors, saying the United States would experience a salt shortage and that England paid President Woodrow Wilson to fight Germany. So all in all, the author says that most of the rules protected the military. However, some of them protected the homeland and civilians, which included bans on revealing secret police activities, harbor defenses, locations of fixed land defenses in the U.S., and merchant ships' departure times. Such rules address the fact that German submarines and saboteurs were attacking the homeland and civilians. For instance, in 1918, the second year America was in the war, German submarines sank 45 U.S. merchant ships and other vessels and laid mines along America's east coast. Also, before and during the war, German saboteurs committed 200 acts of sabotage against America, including detonation of an ammunition plant on Black Tom Island, New Jersey, killing 4 people and injuring hundreds. So it's unclear to me exactly, if these rules prevented attacks, or it doesn't seem like, and I'm not saying that's because they don't exist, but it doesn't seem like there's ample evidence that some of these attacks were caused directly by the press leaking or publishing certain information. But then again, the article concludes that the press as a whole never really wavered from following the government's or military's censorship rules. Now, is that because a lot of people actually didn't want to violate the rules because they were patriotic about the war, or is it because the rules were in place? You know what I mean? It's just unclear exactly what the motivations were. However, there were numerous violations, but the CPI chairman, George Creel, estimated only 2 or 3 were intentional among journalists who disagreed with the rules. Some violations revealed information on secret weapons and military operations in progress. So with the outbreak of World War II, FDR stated that some degree of censorship is essential in wartime. It is necessary that prohibitions against the domestic publication of some types of information contained in long existing statutes be rigidly enforced. He didn't name those statutes, but he could only have been referring to the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Alien Registration Act of 1940, which is called the Smith Act. The only laws in 1941 that banned the disclosure of certain war information, which couldn't have been the Sedition Act of 1918. Excuse me, I think I read that paragraph wrong, sorry. Roosevelt could only have been referring to the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Alien Registration Act of 1940, because in 1941, those two were the only laws that banned the disclosure of certain war information. The Smith Act, which Congress passed before America entered into World War II, which was in 1940, wanted to regulate peacetime sedition, banned such information as printed matter that advised, counseled, or urged insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty by any member of the military. So aside from those 2 laws, the government had the Communications Act of 1934 to control journalists. This law said that in wartime, the president could close or take control of radio stations and seize all radio equipment in them, with just compensation for owners, at least. Many radio broadcasters were aware that the government could use the law any time, but to their relief, the government kept radio control in private hands. So one of the main reasons why I'm going through all this is just to say that what we're experiencing isn't necessarily new, because a lot of people have this feeling that, that doesn't mean I'm not concerned with what's happening. I think it's atrocious. But a lot of people have this feeling that, whatever the most recent affront to the Constitution is really a big sign of things going hellishly off the rails, when in fact a lot of these things have precedents going way, way back. Like, I don't know, the Alien and Sedition Acts that occurred, I've covered on the show, that were the subject of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in John Adams' Federalist presidency and Congress, making it illegal to criticize the president and things like that. So yes, this all has precedent, and PayPal, whether or not it's a sock puppet of the US government, all this has precedence. It's just a little bit more insidious now, it feels like. So the government only charged a few journalists with violating the Espionage or Smith Act. The 2 major cases involving the Chicago Tribune and the Galilean, like Galilee, which was the Galilean, a small pro-Nazi publication. Many government officials, however, including President Roosevelt and cabinet members, wanted more charges against journalists. Interesting. For instance, FDR pressured Attorney General Francis Biddle to prosecute the Washington Times-Herald, the New York Daily News, and other other subversive sheets for frequent criticism of war policies and disclosing classified information. However, Biddle, a staunch defender of civil liberties, prevented nearly all indictments against journalists from proceeding. So the Chicago Tribune case, Chicago Tribune was being prosecuted after it published an article indicating America had broken Japan's code of communication, but the trial was causing too much publicity and the government dropped the charges after Japan failed to notice. The editor of the Galilean, the small pro-Nazi organization, got 10 years in prison for numerous statements in his articles, which basically was criticizing the U.S. government. Just as in World War I, officials censored journalist communications and dispatches, including cables saying the Allied forces would invade the island of Alderney off the coast of France, and that a British recon force landed on the island of Lampedusa in Italy to plan an Allied attack. So you have some of those. You also have an issue of the New Negro World for a line that read, "To hell with Pearl Harbor." In two other examples, censors suppressed an issue of Time magazine for an article about a riot in an enemy prison and an issue of the Lockheed Vegas Star for revealing info on air raid shelters and evacuation plans at war material factories. The post office blocked 6 publications in the U.S. mail. Although they wanted to censor more, it relied on Biddle's opinion to determine which publications deserved suppression. Biddle recommended few for suppression, fearing a repeat of World War I's widespread censorship. Yeah, well, I mean, it seems like Biddle blocked a few, but he did, he blocked few publications, but he did still block 6. So I don't know if he's a champion, could be called, of civil rights. Of those suppressed was Father Charles Coughlin's Social Justice magazine, which contained statements saying America would lose the war and was fighting for money. An issue of X-Ray in Indiana was blocked after it declared Pearl Harbor sunk the hopes of Jewry in this country. So it seems a little anti-Semitic there. Same thing happened to Publicity for an article calling President Roosevelt a dictator under control of, quote, Mongolian Jews. Interesting. So war correspondent situation in World War II was similar to theirs in World War I. They allowed 1,650 correspondents into the war zones, subjected them to some of the same censorship rules. There were other rules for correspondents that were not in rules for journalists in the United States. So there were review systems, quite the same. General Eisenhower suppressed reports that Patton slapped 2 shell-shocked U.S. soldiers and called them cowards. The military censored photos from the front lines, especially photos officials believed could reveal military info or enemies could use for propaganda. At the war's start, the military prohibited publication of photos showing dead U.S. soldiers, which officials said could hurt the war's public support. However, this was relaxed in 1943 to encourage Americans to make sacrifices similar to those of soldiers. How sick is that? I mean, there's no principle there at all. Jesus. It's not bad enough that we used our soldiers in life as cannon fodder, but now we're going to reverse some kind of modicum of respect for them, in their eyes, at least, as some kind of principle. Jeez. So it's surprising so much censorship occurred 65 years ago, considering today's standards for a free press. I don't know where this guy, I mean, I like the guy, the result of this article here. I'm talking about the author of this article. I like him for his conclusion about it here, but I don't know where he gets this idea that we have such a free press in this country right now that is defending democracy and democratic ideals and serving as the watchdog. But in American allied countries, he writes further, there was a widespread spirit of we're all in this together to defeat the Axis. Journalists largely felt that by sacrificing their right to free reporting, they were doing their part to win the war. Ugh. Many journalists cooperated with censorship due to fears of there being, as the war continued, more restrictive government measures against press freedom. In January 1942, there was an Office of Censorship, interesting, charged with overseeing all wartime censorship efforts, and it issued the following 2 documents listing voluntary censorship rules: the Code of Wartime Practices for the American Press and the Code of Wartime Practices for American Broadcasters. The types of information in both OC codes, Office of Censorship codes, were essentially the same. They issued a separate document to radio broadcasters mainly to explain they had to be more careful than print journalists because some radio frequencies traveled immediately across the ocean. OC Director Byron Price estimated 99.99% of journalists agreed with the codes, but as mentioned, the government and military's other censorship efforts encouraged widespread compliance. William Hearst claimed to embrace the new restrictions, even though he opposed the World War I restrictions. The New York Times said that there was nothing objectionable about the codes, while the Washington Post said the OC, quote, commendably designed the rules to assure minimum interference with wartime reporting. So you have all the mainstream media sources just carrying water for the regime. National Broadcasting Company and Columbia Broadcasting System said that the radio code was common sense and reasonable. So, yeah, the OC trained journalists even volunteered as missionaries to educate other journalists about safe reporting. However, some people had outspoken dissent. For instance, the Cleveland Plain Dealer's editor and journalists were old enough to know what to print. The Cleveland Plain Dealer's editor said that journalists were old enough to know what to print, and the Bismarck Tribune claimed the government would use the codes to hide its wartime actions from the public. At least one weekly paper's editor, the names of the paper seemed somewhat indifferent to the codes, as she wrote an OC missionary. She said to the missionary, "Tell the censors I'll do what they want, but I won't answer their damn letters." So the OC codes drew from the CPI's rules in World War I. Some rules were new, including a rule discouraging descriptions of weather in U.S. localities. The secrecy prevented German submarines from best planning East Coast attacks. New rules banned mention of details of damage enemies might inflict during attacks on U.S. targets. Things like that. So it seemed like a lot more protection for the U.S. mainland itself. Few more rules for radio broadcasters than for print journalists, including bans on disclosing experiments with war equipment or materials, the number of military enlistments, and any details of new international points of communication. So they updated the code 4 times during the war. Later editions of both codes listed numerous other types of potentially dangerous information. A lot of it seems like Homeland Security stuff. So since I'm running a little long on time, I'm just going to kind of gloss over the Korean War. Even though the U.S. government violated many civil liberties in the Cold War, the Korean War involved no news censorship in the U.S., which including no attempted prosecutions of journalists under the Espionage Act. However, the correspondence that was embedded with the military had the same kind of, a mandatory censorship system on correspondence. So the same kind of system. According to military records, in just December 1952, the military censored 1,199 articles, 5,027 photos, 174 radio broadcasts, and 75 films. For much of the Korean War, censors even stamped correspondence items as approved, approved as revised, delayed, or disapproved. In an example of film censorship, censors disapproved mentions of U.S. POWs in so many words of, quote, receiving good food and excellent treatment from kindly captors. Some censorship seemed reasonable, such as censorship of mention of types of tanks, such as Pershings, and the armaments, such as 90 millimeter guns, which would identify the tank. Even compared with World Wars I and II, the Korean War had many overly broad rules, particularly ones prohibiting release of criticism, of command decisions, and the conduct of Allied soldiers on the battlefield, the state of the maintenance of services, including any references to reserves, unverified reports of atrocities, results of enemy actions that could encourage him or cause despondency in our own ranks, names of specific units, titles of armed forces personnel, vilification of U.S. Armed Forces personnel, and information that could bring U.S. forces or allies into disrepute. These rules covering vilification and disrepute rankled correspondents more than most other rules. Details on the strength, efficiency, morale, or organization of U.S. forces, and information that could hinder Allied forces' efforts. The big difference being is that there was no protection. The Korean War's rules offered no protection from potentially dangerous press disclosures for the homeland or civilians, or special protection for the president. However, from the government's or military's perspective, these omissions were appropriate because the U.S. was doing all fighting overseas. So, in the Vietnam War, on the other hand, Kennedy promised the government would never, quote, censor the news or otherwise control journalists. He asked journalists, however, to carefully report stories dealing with national security, warning, quote, this nation's foes have openly boasted of acquiring through our newspapers information they would otherwise hire agents to acquire. However, in isolated incidents, President Kennedy and the other presidents during the Vietnam War failed to keep the promise of no censorship or control. In one incident, Kennedy tried to get the New York Times' David Halberstam removed from Vietnam. Halberstam wrote an article describing how the U.S. military was losing ground to the VC, but, quote, doesn't have the answer yet on how to handle the situation. However, the Times refused to do so and convinced Halberstam to postpone his upcoming vacation, so it was clear the Times ignored Kennedy's request. LBJ took office in '63 and took similar actions against journalists, particularly CBS broadcaster Morley Safer. On TV from Vietnam, Safer showed U.S. Marines burning huts in the village Cam Nay, while villagers looked terrified. However, Safer did not mention that the Marines just fought VC soldiers there and at least one hut accessed secret VC tunnels. Believing Safer unfairly criticized Marines, Johnson cursed out CBS President Frank Stanton for allowing the story to air and asked Stanton to fire Safer. Johnson also ordered the Federal Bureau of Investigation and CIA to investigate Safer for communist ties. According to Safer, the investigations found no ties, and CBS kept Safer. Nixon took several actions, beginning to when he took power in '68 against journalists during Vietnam. '71, he asked the Supreme Court to block publication of articles about the Pentagon Papers and the New York Times, Washington Post, and other newspapers that disclosed, among other revelations, decisions by U.S. officials to secretly escalate the Vietnam War. Although the newspapers won the case, the government was able to block publication of articles by the Times and Post while the court decided the case. Also, while the government challenged the Times and Post in court, 18 other newspapers published information from the Pentagon Papers. Of these 18 papers, the government obtained temporary injunctions on only the Boston Globe and St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which the government says most jeopardized national security. The injunctions range from 5 to 15 days and were the first times in U.S. history a federal court imposed prior restraints on journalists. Nixon also wiretapped reporters, including columnist Joseph Kraft, who said Nixon failed to properly end the war, and CBS reporter Marvin Kalb, after he revealed America's secret bombing of Cambodia, the location of numerous VC soldiers. In fact, FBI agents listened to Kalb's calls for months to discover who leaked him the details. In another example, Nixon ordered the tapping of the New York Times' William Beecher after he disclosed America had secretly escalated bombing in Cambodia. U.S. presidents throughout the war and other officials controlled journalists by giving them false information or withholding information. For example, Kennedy told reporters U.S. soldiers were uninvolved in combat in Vietnam despite knowing numerous U.S. soldiers had fought and died there. In '66, Johnson denied the fact that the military increased bombings in North Vietnam, including residential areas. Nixon kept the bombing of Cambodia secret, and he tried concealing bombings of parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. Although one thing that was different is that the U.S. military refrained from censoring correspondence in Vietnam through a mandatory review system. There was no censorship of internal communications, so U.S. correspondents could always send dispatches from countries near Vietnam to the United States. Another reason was correspondents would have been outraged with mandatory censorship, and the U.S. military wanted to avoid attention to the increasingly unpopular war. So the U.S. military didn't believe that a review system would have been effective. Other reasons were that military censorship would require large bureaucracy and help of members of South Vietnam's military. Instead, they issued voluntary censorship rules, but for violations, the military could suspend or revoke correspondents' accreditation. However, correspondents were relatively free to cover military operations. They could travel with the military, even on planes in between military bases, and roam freely in Vietnam. It was easy for journalists in the U.S. to become war correspondents. All they had to do was be sponsored by a media company and agree to the voluntary censorship rules. There were 1,951 U.S. correspondents who covered the war, 146 of whom were freelance journalists. Sometimes the military blocked access to operations, including in 1962. They were blocked from covering helicopter attacks on the VC because Kennedy did not want journalists to know, quote, of the current military situation. The military also barred correspondents from Da Nang, which was a major South Vietnamese air base, because of the possibility they could alert the VC to future air attacks. And as mentioned above, military blocked press coverage of U.S. bombings in Cambodia and Laos. So these voluntary censorship measures were issued in 1964, and they were called the ground rules. According to the New York Times, most correspondents agreed with the rules, that there was little quarrel about their necessity. A minority of correspondents even asked the military to censor correspondents' dispatches through a review system. In fact, the LA Times' Jack Foisey purposely violated a rule banning mention of troop movements to convince the military to do so. Other correspondents claimed that the military could use censorship rules to prevent disclosures of embarrassing information. They said these rules were unnecessary because some other correspondents said that some rules were unnecessary because the VC or NVA would already know through spies or other sources the restricted information. So sounds like what was said in World War I. The Chicago Tribune said voluntary censorship rules could start a slippery slope, ending with involuntary censorship. So moving further, in the Persian Gulf War, there was the return of mandatory censorship through a review system. Correspondents had to submit all articles, video, and photos to the Department of Defense's public affairs officers, who checked for security information. The Operation Desert Shield ground rules and supplementary guidelines listed, including rules against reporting, intelligence, collection activities, and rules of engagement. If correspondents objected to any censorship by the public affairs officers, it could take days for final decisions, which technically belonged to correspondents' respective news organizations. However, fewer correspondents chose to follow the required appeal process, which included such steps as, quote, review by the Joint Information Bureau director and the appropriate news media representative, and to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs for review with the appropriate bureau chief. Man, bureaucracy. Even though the military claimed there would be no censorship, there were exceptions. Military officers censored stories about U.S. pilots viewing pornography on breaks, giddy U.S. fighter pilots coming back from a mission, and soldiers attending Christian services in Saudi Arabia, a mostly Muslim country. Although journalists often endured the presence of public affairs escorts, journalists often endured the presence of public affairs escorts even during interviews of U.S. soldiers because of security, safety, and mission requirements determined by the host commander, and the military frequently blocked correspondents most critical of the military from interviewing military commanders. So here's one of the big major takeaways. We kind of skipped to the conclusion here. First, there has been little consistent consensus expressed in censorship rules from war to war on specific types of war information. As the appendix shows, but not to necessarily show legitimacy in avoiding bloodshed, only 5 types of information have been in each war's censorship rules, including information on future military operations, military plans, secret war plans, movements of troops, warships, fighter planes, ships, or rails, statistics on critical war supplies, effectiveness of the enemy's camouflage, cover, deception, direct and indirect fire, intelligence collection, or security measures, and 5, aerial photos, views of sites of military importance. So you would think for a topic or the information war, as important as it is, you would think if there was a unifying kind of idea behind the censorship of these specific disclosures, you would think that it would be a bit more uniform throughout the different wars because, while technology changes and things like that, war doesn't often change. And maybe the speed at which you could transmit information did change a little bit. But you would think that if there's some kind of consensus behind the reason to limit certain types of information, it would have been more uniform throughout all of these wars that were sampled. The other observation that he makes is that throughout all 5 wars, most censorship rules protected the military from possibly dangerous press disclosures as opposed to the homeland or civilians. So he says, surely this trend was because all the wars have involved the sending of U.S. troops to fight overseas, and the homeland and civilians have generally been far from war zones. However, it seems like the decision to censor was not to protect U.S. citizens or to protect the mainland, as the wars are often sold, right? They're often sold as being protecting the homeland and the state because that's how they get us to agree to it, while all the rules are not to protect the homeland, except as much as the military being intact and having success would protect the homeland, right? Because the rules are all about protecting the military explicitly. And there's some interesting discussion kind of at the end of the article talking about what exactly was the reason for some of these censorship rules, because for a lot of it, it seems like journalists are not exactly out for exposing the enemy, for exposing their home country's positions in the war. Like the reasons, and I think this goes into the reasons why correspondents and journalists report on these things, is because they want to serve as a watchdog primarily, and not because they want to be causing the defeat of their home country's military forces. At least I'm thinking about my own motivations in this. But the information that they're after is not necessarily to provide or to aid the military defeat of their host country. It is to uncover deception, to uncover evil, to uncover bad acting, to uncover those kind of things. And indeed, he says, although there is no estimate of the number of lives saved, surely some censorship rules throughout the wars, such as those covering secret war plans and intelligence collection activities, have avoided bloodshed. And then he gives a slight hat tip to General Sherman in the article's opening quote. But what I mean, though, is that even though the author says this, he doesn't point to any solid examples that I was able to see. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there were 1 or 2, but I don't recall any concrete examples of how a journalist revealing information directly led to deaths or anything like that. Maybe there was some reason for the publication of shipping lanes or something that allowed U-boats to attack and destroy U.S. merchant ships, but he doesn't point to any specific examples or anything like that. So here's the appendix where, and I'll put this in the show notes page, where he puts all of the different information that was censored from each war, because I think it's an interesting comparison here, table that he puts together. So anyways, that's the article by Daniel Smith. So now, I recognize we're an hour and 20 minutes in. This is kind of a longer episode, but like I said, there's so much information here. Hey everybody, Patrick McFarland here. I'm really excited to tell you guys about the newest sponsor of the Liberty Weekly podcast, and that is Crowd Health. When I launched my law practice a few months ago, I found myself without health insurance. I searched through the individual healthcare plans on healthcare.gov and was appalled at the high cost and poor coverage. So I decided to try out Crowd Health. That's right, I use Crowd Health myself. Now, there's a reason why healthcare costs are so high. That is because healthcare is no longer something that takes place between you and your doctor. Everyone listening to this podcast should already know that big insurance and big pharma unite with big government to squeeze every penny that they can from you. This, of course, drives costs up. For instance, Obamacare caps the percentage of profit that health insurance companies can make off of premiums. How then do they make more money? Well, they charge a higher premium. So there's no incentive for insurance companies to negotiate for lower prices on your behalf. Enter crowd health. You pay one low monthly total, usually less than $200, to fund a healthcare account that is yours. Then you choose whatever doctor that you want. And if you have a big bill, Crowd Health will crowdfund that bill for you so you can pay the doctor or hospital quickly. Now, to help you along the way, Crowd Health will assign you and your family a personal care representative. My care representative is named Maggie, and if I have any questions, Maggie is just a text or a phone call away. When I enrolled, Maggie called me to get to know me. We spent a great deal of time discussing my needs and goals with my own healthcare. Maggie's great. Stop supporting the broken health insurance system with your hard-earned dollars. Go to joincrowdhealth.com now and experience freedom from health insurance like I do. Right now, you can get your first 3 months for just $99 per month. That's almost 50% off the normal price, and it's a heck of a lot less than a high-deductible healthcare plan. So just go to joincrowdhealth.com and use promo code LW99 at sign-up to tell them that I sent you. That's joincrowdhealth.com, promo code the letter L, the letter W, and the number 99. Now, disclaimer, Crowd Health is not health insurance, and that's a good thing. It's a totally different way of paying for healthcare. Terms and conditions may apply. So if we fast forward a little bit to the modern day, we just spent all that time going through what the U.S. policy has been and how it's mostly been geared towards at least protecting the military efforts, efforts of the military and soldiers from being in direct danger or something like that. And in fact, that was kind of the justification for a lot of the censorship that the U.S. military indeed did do. Uniformly throughout that time, it was censorship on the reportings for the purpose of protecting the U.S. military and from direct attack. So naturally, what would any conversation in the modern day about journalism and wartime, what conversation would be complete without discussing the case of Julian Assange? Because if you all remember, Julian Assange, one of the biggest arguments that I remember being put forward about why he's so dangerous is because this allegation that his disclosures harmed U.S. national security or endangered troops in the field. And we have this article from NBC, review of WikiLeaks docs sees no smoking gun. A Pentagon official, an ongoing Pentagon review of secret documents made public by the WikiLeaks website, has so far found no evidence that the disclosure harmed U.S. national security or endangered troops in the field, saying there was a massive flood, one of WikiLeaks dumps. Secret documents published by WikiLeaks website, a review has found so far no evidence that the disclosure harmed U.S. national security or endangered troops in the field. This is July 26, 2010. The initial Pentagon assessment is far less dramatic than initial statements from the Obama White House Sunday night, after 3 major news organizations, New York Times, Guardian, and Der Spiegel, published what was touted as an unprecedented secret archive of classified military documents relating to the war in Afghanistan. The documents appear to show, among other matters, close collaboration between elements of the Pakistani intelligence service and the Taliban, an awkward issue that U.S. intelligence officials have strenuously complained about for some time, but are loath to talk about publicly. So, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Media Operations told NBC News Monday that a preliminary review by a Pentagon assessment team has so far not identified any documents whose release could damage national security. Moreover, he said none of the documents reviewed so far carries classification level above secret, the lowest category of intelligence materials in terms of sensitivity. The review team consisted of military intelligence analysts, lawyers, and others working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other elements of the Defense Department, examining the WikiLeaks material to determine whether the disclosures endanger U.S. troops in the field, harm U.S. national security, or compromise sources and methods for intelligence gathering. LePan noted that they haven't found anything yet, but that WikiLeaks has yet to publish all the documents it claims to have. Backtracking here, the Pentagon review has been stymied by the fact that for at least part of the day Monday, the military team was unable to access WikiLeaks, apparently because of the traffic. So, there's some discussion here about Bradley Manning possibly providing the leak. But here's another article from The Guardian. This one is a little bit more recent, July 2013. Bradley Manning leak did not result in deaths by enemy forces, court hears. Counterintelligence officer who investigated WikiLeaks' impact undermines argument that Manning leak put lives at risk. The U.S. counterintelligence official who led the Pentagon's review into the fallout from the WikiLeaks disclosures of state secrets told the Bradley Manning sentencing hearing on Wednesday that no instances were ever found of any individual killed by enemy forces as a result of having been named in the releases. Brigadier General Robert Carr, a senior counterintelligence officer who headed the Information Review Task Force that investigated the impact of WikiLeaks disclosures on behalf of the DoD, told the court at Fort Meade that they had uncovered no specific examples of anyone who had lost his or her life in reprisals that followed the publication of the disclosures on the internet. He said, quote, "I don't have a specific example." Of course, it has been one of the main criticisms of WikiLeaks that they put lives at risk, particularly in Iran and Afghanistan. The admission by the Pentagon's chief investigator into the fallout from WikiLeaks that no such casualties were identified marks a significant undermining of such arguments. So I think that's really interesting. They go into some specific examples that I'll let you guys read about through the show notes page here. And here's another article that I'll include from Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press talking about WikiLeaks and the Espionage Act of 1917. As you'll recall, we discussed it in that article that we went through here, Avoiding Bloodshed, by Daniel Smith, Avoiding Bloodshed, U.S. Journalists and Censorship in Wartime. But it talks about the collateral murder video and journalists. There's a heading, "Journalists have never been successfully prosecuted. As it's currently written, the Espionage Act of 1917 makes it a crime to hurt the U.S. or benefit a foreign country by collecting or communicating info that would harm the national defense. It is also a crime to enter an installation or obtain a document connected to the national defense in order to hurt the United States or benefit a foreign country. Knowingly receiving classified information that has been obtained illegally as well as passing it on also runs afoul of the Espionage Act." But it's incredibly vague and poorly defined in its terms, and it's hard to say exactly what it does and does not cover. The U.S. government has never successfully prosecuted anyone other than a government employee for disseminating unlawfully leaked classified information. Thus, the Supreme Court has never ruled on the constitutionality of such a prosecution. The closest they came was under the Pentagon Papers, New York Times versus the United States, when the court rejected the government's attempt to prevent the New York Times and the Washington Post from publishing a leaked copy of a top-secret study of the Vietnam War. So there's a bunch more information there that I don't necessarily have time to get into. But if you want to read about, the involvement of the Supreme Court under the Espionage Act and the Julian Assange case, I'll put this link in the show notes page as well. And even more recently, we have this piece in Reuters talking about the current Julian Assange litigation. This is dated September 2020. Previous hearing in London, it was, Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, testifying in defense of Julian Assange, talking about how can you possibly say, James Lewis was the lawyer representing U.S. authorities in the Assange hearing, and said that Assange was not wanted for publishing the 2007 video of collateral murder, but he was wanted for disclosing a small number of documents with the unredacted names of sources or informants. The lawyer, James Lewis, said many of these had suffered harm or threats because they had been named. He said some had disappeared, although he conceded that there was no evidence this was directly linked to the WikiLeaks publication. Lewis said, "How can you possibly say that there's no evidence that Mr. Assange's publication of WikiLeaks put anyone in danger? That's just pure nonsense," Lewis said. But Daniel Ellsberg disagrees. He said that there is absolutely no evidence of physical harm or deaths because of the leaks. The exchange with Lewis led to an outburst from Assange in the courtroom, with the judge warning him to remain silent. So I think, again, kind of going back to this Daniel Smith piece that we were discussing, it really seems like it's not the intention of reporters. And in fact, many reporters are very, very careful. And in this Reuters article we were just discussing goes into more depth on what was redacted and how WikiLeaks did redact, and other reporters did redact information, and said that WikiLeaks, according to Der Spiegel, had agreed to hold back about 15,000 documents for publication. That sensitivity was talked about constantly. This reporter from Der Spiegel tells the court. Julian Assange was concerned that the media should take measures, quote, so no one could be harmed. So then, to take things back full circle, as we kind of put an end note on this episode, in December 2010, we have kind of a familiar story. WikiLeaks payment processor to sue card companies. So WikiLeaks payment processor said Thursday was preparing to sue credit card companies Visa and MasterCard over their refusal to process donations to the secret spilling website. So basically, the CEO of DataCell, an Icelandic company, told the Associated Press that he would seek damages from the American financial companies over their decision to block WikiLeaks. It's difficult to believe that such a large company as Visa can make a political decision, Fink said in a telephone interview from Switzerland. In an earlier statement, his company had defended the WikiLeaks, saying, quote, "It is simply ridiculous to think WikiLeaks has done anything criminal." A host of U.S. internet and financial companies have severed their links to the controversial website WikiLeaks, some citing terms of use violations. Earlier this week, Visa and MasterCard said they would stop processing payments to WikiLeaks, although they have not offered a detailed explanation of why. Sounds familiar. Supporters have reacted with outrage, with many noting that unsavory organizations, such as the American KKK and the far-right British National Party, both claim to accept Visa and MasterCard. So, interesting. Credit card donations to WikiLeaks were frozen at least until next week, something to which he said was costing money. Fink's statement comes as internet payment company PayPal says it will return the money frozen in WikiLeaks' account to the foundation that was fundraising for it. In a blog post, PayPal defended its decision, which it denied had come as a result of lobbying from the U.S. government. And it sounds like that decision was to freeze WikiLeaks payments and then unfreeze them. So here's another, a more recent story. MasterCard breaks ranks in WikiLeaks blockade. This is July 3rd, 2013. MasterCard has broken ranks in the U.S. link. This is from WikiLeaks website, by the way. For almost 3 years, U.S. financial giants have Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, the Bank of America, and Western Union have been engaged in an unlawful banking blockade against WikiLeaks. The blockade started in December 2010 in response to the start of WikiLeaks' publication of U.S. diplomatic cables. Now, one of the financial companies involved in the blockade, MasterCard International, has backed down and reversed its position. WikiLeaks was notified of MasterCard's international change in position by Valitor, the Iceland partner for Visa and MasterCard. That's because on April 24, 2013, WikiLeaks and DataCell won a lawsuit which had been running for 2 years against Valitor for breach of contract and blockading WikiLeaks donations at the behest of Visa and MasterCard. The Icelandic Supreme Court ordered Valitor to recommence processing donations to WikiLeaks. So Valitor complied and reopened its gateway, but gave formal legal notice that it would terminate its contract and reclose the gateway on July 1st, 2013, citing a unilateral termination clause in the contract. Now they've reversed their position fully and announces it will honor the contract with Datacell and process payments to WikiLeaks. So we have, let's see, other financial companies have not yet retracted their illegal blockade on WikiLeaks, including PayPal, Western Union, and Bank of America. And here's an article from November 2014. Protesters against WikiLeaks banking blockade, the PayPal 14 largely victorious, saying that, let's see, more than 1,000 people took part in a harmless online protest against the blockade, which attempted to flood the PayPal website with network requests. This talks about WikiLeaks being blocked from PayPal and those other financial institutions in 2010. Now, this article, again from 2014, says the banking blockade against WikiLeaks was subsequently found to be illegal in the European courts, and most of the companies involved, including PayPal, Visa, and MasterCard, have conceded defeat. A number of the PayPal blockade protesters were charged by U.S. authorities. For almost 4 years, these protesters, most of whom had never engaged in a protest before, faced threats of imprisonment for what was, by all accounts, a harmless measure against extra-legal economic censorship. The most well-known subgroup, the PayPal 14, had a significant victory on Thursday, beating felony convictions and jail time. Each will still have to pay $5,600 in restitution, a figure drastically lower than the $5.5 million in damages that PayPal initially and falsely claimed. Supporters of the protesters, including the Wow Holland Foundation, have raised monies to defray these costs. So you have PayPal 14. Hopefully something comes up like this with the PayPal situation currently as it is. And hopefully these different outlets that I was talking about at the beginning of the episode will sue in court and will probably win. Who knows? And of course, as we wrap up here, I'd be completely remiss if I didn't mention, in terms of the U.S. government fighting anti-war dissenting voices, I'd be completely remiss if I did not mention the FBI going after antiwar.com, and this piece by Justin Raimondo, originally published August 22nd, 2011. I'm not going to go into all of this information here because that's kind of, I'm already an hour and a half into this. But I mean, it really bears that you guys would read this episode about antiwar.com and the FBI. I'm just really concerned that, after PayPal has gone after these other anti-war activists, that, knock on wood, hopefully other outlets are not next. Certain outlets that my work may appear on. And I stand in solidarity with MintPress News and Consortium News and Geopolitics and Empire and all these other creators and activists who have been blocked off of PayPal. And I hope that there's legal action, and I hope that these decisions are reversed. I'm not going to go through, I don't have time to go through the Unlimited Hangout Whitney Webb article, but if you want to hear more against the new domestic terror strategy, I think that you guys should go check out Whitney Webb's article. It's about a 13-minute read, but it foresees the establishment of the Ministry of Truth, as people have been calling it, and this ridiculous, what's-her-face, Nina Yankowicz, and her position on the Department of Homeland Security Disinformation Board. So we'll probably be covering this as it develops a bit more in the recent future, the near future. And again, there's one more thing I wanted to mention. There was an article written by Kyle Anzalone talking about House Republicans introducing a bill to give Biden sweeping authorities to wage war in Ukraine. And I think this is incredibly dangerous. It kind of parallels the 2002 AUMF, which gives the president nearly a blank check to wage war. The bill does not include oversight on the determination of weapons of mass destruction or use a sunset date So he, I guess to go through this story, this was May 1st. So yesterday, as I'm recording this, this episode will probably come out May 3rd. House Republican introduces bill to give Biden sweeping authorities to wage war in Ukraine. Adam Kinzinger will authorize war. The legislation by Representative Adam Kinzinger will authorize war with Russia in response to WMDs. So on Sunday, the Illinois Republican announced a new authorization, a new AUMF, which, if passed, will allow Joe Biden to deploy American troops to defend Ukraine if Russia uses chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. So just incredibly scary stuff here. And it just underscores how needed and necessary work like MintPress News and Consortium News are doing, and Geopolitics and Empire. So I recognize this episode was a bit longer than I had intended, but I wanted to give you guys the historical context behind all this because, unfortunately, censorship of the press during wartime is incredibly common throughout our history. And I think that if we look to the past and look to the different ways that censorship has been employed, then we can maybe better understand what's going on and what the future holds. I know that, in a lot of ways, the censorship is more insidious than it was in the past. But if we look back and we can see how the journalists reacted, and unfortunately it seems like a lot of them towed the party lines, but maybe in those dissenting moments, in those dissenting figures, we can find strength to face what is coming down the pike. And I think, make no mistake, that there is a lot of danger coming, and that we need to steel ourselves and strengthen our resolve to persist in standing in opposition and standing up and saying no, to try to bring sanity back to the situation that just seems like it's increasingly spiraling out of control. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this episode, that you were able to find some context for what's happening, some historical context, but to do all those things that I said. So if you like the work that I do, please subscribe, rate, review, hit the bell icon, give the thumbs up, give, fire on Odyssey or anything like that. Subscribe to my show, libertyweekly.net. Support the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org, antiwar.com, MintPress News, Consortium News, Geopolitics and Empire, all these different outlets. Their work, and I guess our work by association, is so important right now to try and get the word out there. So if you want to support me directly, head on over to Substack, libertyweekly.net/Substack. I'm working on a bunch of projects that when I transition to this new website, I'll be launching, which includes an ebook, which will probably include print editions for subscribers, but you will get the ebook by signing up to my email list. So if you want to get that when it comes out, I'll be sending a mass email to everyone with the download link, and I'm looking to get that out in a few weeks here. So hopefully not longer than a month, but I already have a draft ready that it needs development and formatting, and I need to do a little bit more work on it. So libertyweekly.net/Substack, you'll find all of my benefits there. All right. You can sign up for free too and just enjoy the free emails, which I would encourage you guys to do. All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. libertyweekly.net/214 is the show notes for this page, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.